Hey everyone, it's Rob, and thanks for listening in today. I greatly appreciate your time. My guest today, Lodro Rinzler. Lodro has taught Buddhism for 20 years, starting when he was just 18 years old. He is the author of 6 meditation books, including the bestseller, The Buddha Walks into a Bar, and the co-founder of Mindful Meditation Studios in New York City. His books, Walk Like a Buddha and The Buddha Walks into the Office, both have received independent publisher book awards. Named one of 50 innovators shaping the future of wellness by Sonima, Rinzler's work has been featured in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, Good Morning America, CBS, and NBC. During our chat, we spent the majority of our time on a very timely topic, something that we are all dealing with on a daily basis and have been for a very long time, and that is stress and anxiety. And the useful ways that we can work with our stress and anxiety. Lots and lots of nuggets of wisdom in our conversation. So please enjoy my chat with Lodro Rinzler. Lodro, so great to see you again.
Good to see you. Thanks for having me here.
Absolutely, absolutely. I always like to start with a quote. And so I'm going to read something to you and I'll let you digest it for a second. And I'd love to get your thoughts on it. So it goes like this, quote, "I came gorgeous and genius and magic and perfect and aware and compassionate and wanting to love people and wanting to be connected. And by a series of unfortunate events, societal structures hindered my love and my compassion and my desire to be connected to you and to see you. So I'm literally being liberated from, not liberated into something. I don't have to develop anything. I have to just cultivate the natural, basic goodness of my humanity that I arrived here with." And that's a quote from Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams Sensei. You know that quote?
I do, yes. The unfortunate part of writing these books somewhat back to back is that I imagine that was in the most recent book, the Take Back Your Mind, which is a book on anxiety. And one would probably wonder, like, why is that in relationship to anxiety? But it is the sense that when we go through our life with these veils that we put over ourselves, and it could be the sort of constant 3 stories that are going through our head in a given week, or it could be larger stories about our life, or are we ever going to find love, or are we ever going to be hired, or whatever it is, like these very big things. It does disconnect us from the present moment. And I mean, this is the real snapshot of probably the entirety of our conversation, I imagine. But like when we actually practice meditation, what we're doing is taking some time off from those stories and coming into the present moment long enough to realize this innate sense of goodness that Angel was talking about. That there is this sense of, in Buddhism, she comes from a Zen tradition. I come from primarily Tibetan Buddhist tradition. But in both, there's this sense that underneath all of these layers of confusion and neurosis and stories we tell ourselves, we're inherently good, complete, whole as is. Mm-hmm. And as she points out so beautifully there, I do love that quote, that this is not something we have to earn. This is not something we have to go out and get. It is primordial. It has always been here. And I think, part of why that particular quote resonates with me is this sense that when we spend time with small children, we don't see them sitting around doubting themselves, like, oh, is anyone going to like me for me? If they don't have that, it's not built into with the factory settings of being born, right? Like that's learned behavior that we have those stories. And I'm not saying it's nothing. I think a lot of us learn those stories because someone hurt us or because something went wrong, and we internalize and make these things a lot about ourselves. We take things very personally. And as a result, we feel very disconnected from that inherent goodness, but it's there. And that's that sense of like, oh, I came into this world with that. Like that's the sort of most moving part of that quote to me, because I think we forget sometimes that back when we were young, we did not carry so much of the stories and baggage that we currently carry. That is stuff that we eventually adopted and brought on, or it was put upon us and we never learned how to shake off, is another way of thinking about it. But that's not inherently who we are.
Your name is unique to me. Is there any background around the name Lodro?
Sure. So I actually was raised in a Buddhist household, and I, from a young age, started practicing meditation. And I was, 6 years old when a teacher, a wonderful teacher who's still with us, Lodro Rinzler, came through town. I grew up in New York, and he offered what is known as the refuge vow, which is a very common ceremony that one might take on if they want to sort of just officially say, yeah, I'm a Buddhist. That's basically what it is. We say, yeah, I'm taking this on for the rest of my life. And my parents, not surprisingly, were somewhat hesitant at a young age to be like, do you actually understand what you're doing? And I sort of had some explanation for them that they said, yeah, it seems like it does. And then when you take that particular vow in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, you will often receive a name that is in Tibetan. So the name that was given to me was Lodro Tado. So Lo is mind, Dro is a mind that goes, which actually makes it sound like a speedy mind, but it's generally translated as intellect. And then Tado is sort of the space without limit. So it's considered boundless intellect, which is, they're all very lofty. It's not like I was given a particularly lofty one. They all feel like that. Now, I don't know if I told you this in the past, but the Rinzler part of the name is actually Germanic. And apparently it goes all the way back to a time where I think there's some sort of translation of veal or another type of meat was rins. And that was because my ancestors were butchers. So actually, if we put Lodro and Rinzler together, as I started when I was in my teenage years, then it becomes butcher of intellect, which is probably a little bit more accurate.
That's funny.
Yeah.
Did you understand the meaning from a young age? And if so, did it affect you in any way? Because it does kind of sound lofty.
I don't think like the translation of that word. No, I don't think I thought much about it. I was still going by Paul until I was 17, and I went to a monastic situation where everyone took on their refuge name. And it's like there was a big, moment, really, day or two, where you went from your sort of previous incarnation where you were dressed like a lay practitioner and they shaved the head, you take the robes, you took the vows, and you started going by your refuge name. And I just sort of never went back on the refuge name after that. I just kept going. And I did, I was 17 at the time. So I did end up coming back and going back and finishing high school and so on and so forth. But, I think it was a really lovely experience for me, not only to do that level of deep retreat so young, but also to, well, there are many parts of it. One is the fact that it felt like a real disambiguation between my path and the path of my parents. They had never done what I had done. I think many people go through this when they end up continuing in the religious tradition that they were raised in, that there has to be some sort of split at some point. Maybe you went to this church with your family when you were growing up, and then you moved and you're going to a different church now, or something like that. It could be something like that. But here it was, oh, my parents never went this monastic route. I guess this is my path now. It's not something that we do as a family. So that was young for me to do that, but then also to have the experience of monasticism and to cherish it and to appreciate it and to have at least a glimpse of it so that I sort of understand what I would or would not want to engage in the future.
So, and now you've been teaching meditation for a number of years. Is it like 20 or something like that?
Yeah. So we're sort of going through chronological order inadvertently. I graduated high school a year later and went to university, and naive as I am, I thought I would just go and that there would be a bunch of people there who already knew how to meditate. So I put up posters everywhere, being like, come meditate with me. because at that point I'd never really been without a community to meditate with. And lo and behold, a bunch of people showed up that actually did not know how to meditate. And I was like, oh, we need to get meditation instructors in stat. And I brought in people from the surrounding area, and they were generally very amicable about it until finally they were like, you know what? Like why don't you just go get trained, because you've done all the prerequisites, like just go to the, MFing like teacher training already. So I did. And as you noticed, as mentioned, I lead teacher trainings at this point, for the last 5-6 years. And I always think back to that time and how competent people are that come through this program, because I was just not good at it for the first several years. But that was, to answer your question more directly, that was almost 21 years ago now.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so I sort of stumbled my way through. Again, I was 18 at the time, so it's not, you can only imagine how articulate or not articulate I was. And kept doing it basically ever since.
Mm-hmm. So I started a meditation practice 17 years ago, and I'm curious, what the two of us have seen. What have you noticed over the last 20 years in terms of people being more curious about having a practice and how they might embrace it as a life tool? People that are curious about it, they say things like, I know I should meditate, but I just can't do it. Things like that. Just any insights that come to mind for you.
Yeah, it's a good question. And I do think it's shifted a lot in recent years. I also think just I'm probably prematurely, a grumpy old man about it, my age, because it's simultaneously changed and not changed. The way it's changed is that there are so many more people who are now interested in meditation. And that's wonderful. It is. It's absolutely terrific. What has not really changed is that people still don't really understand what they're getting into. And when I lead these trainings, it's this situation where it's like, listen, gang, what we're essentially doing is holding people's hands long enough for them to be able to do this on themselves. And that means overcoming, sort of being on the front lines of education about what meditation is. So, if someone had never meditated and were listening to this, for example, they might have a lot of preconceived notions, and I'll just rattle them off, that I should be able to meditate and it will feel as relaxing as a massage. If I don't feel relaxed after 10 minutes, then something's wrong with me. It's not, meditation is not for me because I have too many thoughts. And these are all sort of one note, as you can tell, but it is all that sense of like, I can't do it. It's not for me. It's not what I thought it was. And it's because no one's been out there basically being like, no, it's not a one and done thing. It's not a easy thing to just sort of master and check off a list. If it was, then everyone would do it. No one would ever have stress, right? It's this, I equate it with learning a new language, learning a martial art, learning a new musical instrument, any of these things. We wouldn't say, okay, I tried it once for 10 minutes. The violin must not be a good instrument for me because I didn't, play Mozart. That's not how that works. We have to train in it. So the education process here is very much like, okay, we actually, when I say we have to hold people's hands, we have to be able to sort of articulate why this is important, how long it takes to start to see the benefits, encouraging people so that they recognize the progress that they probably don't even notice in themselves, so that they stick with it in the same way that they would if we've just been taught, oh yeah, it's going to take time for me to learn Spanish. That's the way it's going to be.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that same logic has been out there in meditation. People don't think about it in that way. So they get frustrated very easily. So the grumpy part of me is that part that is constantly being like, no, gang, for the millionth time, this is not an easy fix. This isn't, I sit down and I feel zened out or blissed out or whatever is being sort of thrown around in the parlance right now.
So one of the reasons I was so excited to talk to you today is this book you've written about stress and anxiety, Take Back Your Mind, Buddhist Advice for Anxious Times. And I really enjoyed reading it. I have many dog ears, as you can see. And I wanted to ask you first, how do you define stress and anxiety?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So Stress is a physiological response. When, okay, this is more verbose than I probably originally thought. When you were, generations upon generations before, out in the cold, it's sort of snowy here, so it feels appropriate, out in the cold, without shelter, and a saber-toothed tiger came around, we needed, from an evolutionary point of view, a fight, flight, freeze response mode. Well, the freeze is not actually helpful, but fight, flight response mode. That we either fight the thing or we flee from the thing in order to survive. And if you didn't have that sort of response, then you were sort of weeded out of the herd. I mention this because that has not lessened as an evolutionary response, even though here I am inside, it's warm. I do not suspect a saber-toothed tiger is going to come at me. But what could come at me, even in the duration of this, us spending time together, someone could text me out of the blue, say, I need to talk to you right now. And even though they're not even saying you're horrible or something happened and there's an emergency, my body might go through a stress response of, oh my gosh, I don't want to answer this, or okay, I got to end this right now so I can go answer, or whatever it is some sense of fight, flight, perhaps even a freeze response mode. So this is a stress response, and this is normal in that it happens to everyone. It's not great in that that's sort of like just baked into our mind, that we can't differentiate between a saber-toothed tiger and a text message that's vague. But we have that response all the time, and we don't even notice it. I, at this point, live upstate. We were talking earlier before we started recording about how I was in New York City, that when an ambulance would go by, it would often, my shoulders would come up just in response. It's a pretty common response. Anxiety is a little bit different in that when we have that stressful thing happen, we could acknowledge it, sort of see it for what it is, come back into the present moment, let go. But sometimes, and I think maybe the text messages not inadvertently walk down that road, it's not a bad way to go. I could spend, this didn't happen, by the way, but if this did happen, I could spend the entire time that we are on the line together mentally checked out, not really even here, thinking, okay, what do they want from me? What's going on with them? Is it about this? Maybe something happened to their family. I could just spend that mental energy there instead of being present. And that is what is known as anxiety. It's me holding myself in a state of pain because I'm telling myself lots and lots of stories. So this take back your mind thing is when we meditate, and I mentioned this briefly before, we sort of cut through some of those things. We come back to the breath over and over again. That's the real simplicity of the practice. We're with the body breathing, a thought comes up, maybe it is, what did they mean when they sent me that text message? We acknowledge it, we come back. So this anxiety is being cut through over and over again the more we practice meditation. And the more we do that, the more we train the mind. I don't have to chase after every rabbit hole of stressful thinking that comes up. I can actually cut it off and come back into the present moment. There's an analogy that I used in there, which is known as the two arrows. This is not my analogy. This is an old Buddhist analogy. And you're walking through the woods, and out of nowhere, an arrow comes and hits you in the arm. Now, the thing that we know we should do is to pluck out that arrow and start tending to our own healing. Yet what we often will do is we'll sit there and go, who shot me? I don't deserve to be shot. You know who deserves to be shot? So-and-so. They deserve, and you know who shot me? I bet it was that person. They got this wrong. They shouldn't have done this at all. Like, this is unfair. And we just sort of keep perpetuating the stories about it. And those stories that keep us locked in that state of pain, that is what's known as the second arrow. Mm-hmm. So first arrow, pain that happens as part of life. That is normal. Your friend's family very well might be sick. This person very well might be angry, whatever. Like, that's part of life. The part that we then layer on top, that we keep ourselves playing out, well, what if it's this? What if it's that? That is anxiety. That is what we don't actually have to engage in, that second arrow.
Yeah, I loved that story in the book. I'm glad you shared it. I'm curious how you handle stress. I mean, having meditated almost your whole life, you must have it completely under control at this point, right?
I've always, no, is the short answer. I'm going to start there.
It's a life's journey.
It is. Yeah, and I often, another thing that I've really sort of tried to rebel against throughout the 10 years at this point that I've been writing books, that I'm not this, fully enlightened being at the top of the mountain. Like I'm here with you all in the sort of the trenches, sort of working with my own mind. And the way I often think about it is some people sort of, there's a common thing in Buddhism where the way that we like access these teachings is that we hear the teachings, we contemplate the teachings, we meditate on the teachings. That's how we get them. Some people can just hear the teachings once, and then all of a sudden they're like, yeah, okay, I get it. It's in my bones. Some people need to contemplate. What does this mean for me? Some people need to meditate for long periods of time and realization dawns. Me, I have to write a whole book about the thing to even understand it. It's like part of my process. There's periods, the previous book was on heartbreak. It was called Love Hurts, Buddhist Advice for the Heartbroken. And it was the most healing thing for me to go through the process and understand the universal things that we all go through as part of heartbreak, to help heal some of the heartbreak that I had.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing with this, it's like, I feel like I am maybe 10 times better than I was a couple of years ago before I started on that endeavor to really turn my mind to anxiety and the tools that we can work with to actually bring it up, bring our minds back to its sort of resting state. But it took it took me writing a whole book to really start to get better at it. So stress obviously still happens in life. There's still all sorts of things that come up as part of our basic humanity.
Mm-hmm.
I do think I'm a little better at not getting so carried away by those stories though. And that's the important thing, that I have, I employ the tools more rapidly than I did before. And that's how I often think about it with anxiety. It's like a fish for fishing catches the hook and starts taking out the line. And the question is, how far does the line go before we start reeling it back?
Mm-hmm.
So whereas, for example, I'll just continue with the previous example of someone texting us, maybe that we can't get a hold of them and it takes up hours or days before every moment until we actually talk to them and say, oh, I just wanted to check in and see how you were doing. It's like every moment we could fill it with stories and anxiety, and that fish has gone way out there. Instead of days, could it become hours? Instead of hours, could it become minutes? Could we start to catch ourselves before it becomes a full-blown issue in our own mind? That's the idea of just sort of reeling it back. And I think that's something, it's not like when I don't have stress, I don't have anxiety. I'm just much better at catching myself before the fish goes too far.
Yeah. And I love the text analogy because I think we've all been there with that, text and emails. You share a story, just sticking on kind of, you say you're in the trenches, so to speak. So this kind of came to my mind in one of the stories you talked about. You actually lived in the city at the time, and it was a really busy day. You were running around, you moving in with your girlfriend, who's now your wife, and you were racing to make it to a business meeting, and then you got stuck in New York City traffic. And if you know the story I'm referencing, I'm wondering if you could share, a little bit more and what you did.
Yeah. So this is okay. After 6 previous books, I'm like, give meditation a chance, give meditation a chance. When I say that there's some grumpy old man in me, there's some part of me that's like, people are going to read this book and they're not going to meditate. What else can I give them if they're not going to get serious? Or that could act as an entry point for them getting serious.
Mm-hmm.
It really does feel like, when I said hand-holding before, it's like, how do we get people to actually start working with their mind in that consistent way and being willing to take on that training and that consistency over at least a couple weeks? So this is a story that illustrates some of the sort of tips and tricks that are just scattered throughout the book that help us catch ourselves when we have left, the fish has sort of pulled us way out there. We can ask ourselves questions like, is this helpful? When we play out a scenario in our head, maybe the first time we say, okay, yeah, so I do need to talk to them. After the 50th time where we planned every potential conversation, we say, is this helpful? The answer is probably going to come back, no, it's not. Or another phrase that's very similar to that's in the book is this useful? Same thing. No, it's not useful to me anymore. So stuff like that, where we start to just get in the habit of interrupting those thoughts or cutting the line a little bit or reeling it in is probably a better analogy. But to actually get to the story you asked about. So this was a time when, gosh, how long have we been together? So it's been 7.5 years. So I want to say it was, 6.5 years ago or something like that. My wife and I were moving in together. This is before we were married. And I had been subletting my New York apartment, and I pulled the plug. I said, okay, I'm gonna give up the place. We're just gonna be together. I had a very limited window to go in, clear out everything from the subletter, put all my stuff into a U-Haul, drive it from Brooklyn to Astoria, Queens, which shouldn't have been a very big trip, but ultimately became one. And of course, the subletter had left a mess, and I had to sort of go through a lot more work than I thought I would have had to. And it turns out I had more stuff than I thought I had to load into the van. And of course, somewhere in there, someone said, hey, can we talk to you later today about this important work thing? And I had stupidly said yes, because I thought I was going to be out of there much earlier. So long story short, I pull onto some bridge. I don't remember which bridge it is that I was going through. And I hit bumper to bumper traffic. It's already stressful enough driving one of these giant U-Hauls, because in my mind, they're like 3 times the size of every normal car that I drive. And I've got all my belongings in the back. People are honking all around me. And I look at the time, and there's no way I'm going to make this meeting. And I'm playing out all these stories about, how irresponsible am I that I didn't allow enough time to do any of these things? How dumb am I that I, agreed to take this meeting and prioritize that because I, thought I was going to be able to get back? How, unprofessional are these people going to think I am because I can't actually make the meeting? So on and so forth. And those stories are starting to dominate. And this particular sort of trick, I think, is very helpful and very easy to remember to do, which is I took 3 deep breaths in through my nose, then out through my mouth. And this is just 30 seconds, 45 seconds, maybe. It's long enough to reset the nervous system to some degree. Because my body was in complete ball of tension, hitting gas, brake with this giant U-Haul, all of these stories. And it just cut through long enough for my body to sort of reset, for my mind to sort of take a fresh start approach. And then I could go in a different direction, a direction in that case that actually felt a little bit more, well, I was going to say sane, but we'll say calming. And I think that's the thing, where it's like we need to find the interruptions, if you will, that work for us to bring us out of the state of anxiety and into the present moment long enough that we can make better choices. In that particular scenario, lo and behold, they were sitting there in traffic, and they text or email or whatever it is, and I see it pop up, and they say, can we reschedule? Something came up, and the whole meeting didn't even happen, or it happened a week later or something.
Right.
So it is, even the thing that I was worried about, and this is what often happens with anxiety, that the things that we worry about often don't happen. Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche, the great Tibetan Buddhist teacher, came to the West and reputedly said, took one look at us and goes, I don't understand why you all worry so much. Because you either worry about something and it doesn't happen, like in this case, and then you spent all that mental energy and it didn't even happen, it wasn't reality. Or you worry about something and it does happen, and what was the point in worrying about it and spending that mental energy? It happened anyway. And I always think about that. I'm like, oh my God, like the amount of hours of my life that went into telling myself stories about something that didn't even exist, or something that, doesn't even matter and did happen, or whatever. Like, it's not helpful for us.
Right. It isn't. I love this phrase you write about, and that you learned from the great meditation teacher, Joseph Goldstein, quote, it's okay to feel this, unquote. Can you share what that means and how we can use that in our everyday lives?
Yeah, I thought that was such a revolutionary way to feel it, or to think of it. So we think of emotions as these things we want to avoid, particularly like negative emotions. If I mentioned heartbreak before, that's a good example. No one wants to feel heartbreak. No one wants to feel suffering of various sorts. They don't want to feel jealousy. They don't want to feel anger. And yet they're very alluring sometimes. When we think we're really right, we can feel very righteous in our anger. We judge ourselves. And I think there's, a lot of even sort of textual stuff that comes up in Buddhism around, like, don't feel anger or you'll end up in this sort of bad space. I think some of these translations are not great because it implies we're not allowed to feel. We are allowed to feel. There's no way we couldn't feel. Feelings, emotions, these things are part of our mind. What do we do with that though? And I often think of it as, the analogy of a fire, that I'll continue with anger. If anger is a fire and it's sitting there, I can go up to it and I can be there. I can bear witness to it. I can feel the warmth of it. I can hold my hands to it. And that is very different than what we often do, which is that we run around and we grab a lot of tanks of gasoline and we pour it on the fire. And those tanks of gasoline are all of the stories about why we're right and the other person's wrong, for example. And we're just dousing the fire and it just keeps getting bigger and bigger. That's not helping us. It sort of becomes all consuming and overwhelming. And then, it burns down the forest, or we end up paralyzed by our own anger. So what if we didn't feed it a lot of stories? And this practice is very simple, that similar to when we are doing mindfulness meditation of the breath, where we are acknowledging thoughts that come up. Oh, here's why they're right and they're wrong, and I'm wrong, or whatever it is. I'm right, they're wrong. And then we acknowledge it, we come back to the breath. Here we come back to feeling the emotion, to holding our hands up to that fire, to bearing witness to it. Oh, they're such a jerk. I acknowledge that thought, I come back to feeling it. Where is it in the body? Can I just feel the energy of the anger? And in that moment, we would say to ourselves, it's okay to feel this. So this is what Joseph Goldstein encouraged people to say. It's okay to feel this. We just feel the feeling. What happens if we're just holding our hands up to a fire? We don't add anything on top. At some point, the fire dies out of its own accord. It goes through its own process and it's done. That's what happens when we don't add all of these stories to some of these strong emotions. They just sort of naturally pass. That's just the nature of them. Mm-hmm. If I asked you, what were you feeling 3 weeks ago at this exact moment, you probably would not be able to tell me, because it is a bazillion feelings ago, right? It has passed. It came and it went. You didn't fuel it constantly between then and now to the extent that you continue to feel it. So at some point it burned out. Same thing with all of these things. It's just hard to remember it in the moment. Mm-hmm. His colleague, Sharon Salzberg, has a great quote as well, which is, mindfulness isn't hard. We just have to remember to do it. I love that. Right. It's like none of the, as I've been saying these things, it's like, what does a Buddhist teacher do but tell you things that you sort of already know, but you don't always remember to do. Right. That's basically it.
Well said. Can you share the Tibetan Buddhist tradition of looking at our emotions through an analytical lens?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Sure. So there are many ways to work with our strong emotions. And I mean, as I mentioned a moment ago, if you're just doing mindfulness of the breath practice and some strong emotions are coming up, it is actually still very helpful to acknowledge the stories around it, come back to the breath. The breath is a really soothing, stabilizing influence. That's one way of doing it. Another would be a mindfulness of emotions practice, like the practice we just talked about, like it's okay to feel this. And in Tibetan Buddhism, there are some analytical stuff where we start to look at the very nature of emotions. Because, people who are watching us as opposed to just listening to us, they would notice that I've been drinking a glass of water. When I hold this up, you say, yeah, that's a glass of water. If you were curious, I could put a lid on it and I would mail it to you. And I imagine the post office wouldn't let me mail water, but you understand what I'm saying, that you could get this, and then you would say, yeah, and now I'm holding the glass of water. If I said, I'm feeling tired today, which is just went for too long. I'm feeling a little tired today. I can't mail that to you. I can't hand it off to you in the same way. So it must mean that it's a little bit more ephemeral than this glass of water. So when we look at these emotions, we can ask ourselves all sorts of questions, like, where does this emotion live? And if I'm being honest, it's hard for me to pin down exactly where it is. And if I think that's where it is, if I said it's right here in the center of my chest, where does it go when I'm not actively feeling it? What color is it? If I suspect it's a particular color, how do I know for sure? What weight is it? I could tell you what this weighs. I can't tell you what feeling this weighs. Does it have a shape, a size? So the more questions we ask about this, the more we realize that these, I'm about to use a term that I'll do it with you, but I wouldn't often use on a podcast because it's such a loaded term, which is it's empty. It's empty of solid sense of permanent sense of being. So everything is like that, according to Tibetan Buddhism. This idea of a Lodro that I hold, that's just a bunch of stories I tell myself about me. I'm the same body I was however many years ago, when in fact science has told me that every 7 years, every single cell in this body has died and been replaced. It's a completely different body than I had 7 years ago. I would, if I actually was honest with myself and I start sort of looking at the top of my head here, I think that's true. I don't think that's my hair is as lustrous as it once was 7 years ago. Like I gotta acknowledge that. So it's like, it's like I'm not the same Lodro. My experience has changed. My beliefs on very many issues have changed. I would like to think I've gotten more mature in some ways. Like there's certain things I've learned from that I don't want to do anymore and I don't do. Like there's all sorts of things like that happen as part of a human, but we think of ourselves as a solid sense of me. And we would think similarly of our emotions as a solid sense of emotion. That anger, no, Lodro, you don't understand. That anger is real and it's valid and it's, who I am now, and I am angry so-and-so or whatever your name is. Like we think of it as that. And then a year later we say, oh wait, maybe that's not true. And the example that comes to mind here is, I keep coming back to this previous book, Love Hurts, which is about heartbreak. And there's something in it that says, hey, if you're feeling heartbroken, you can reach out to me and, I will be the person that reaches out if you don't have other people to tell you this, that you're going to heal from this, that you're going to love again. And at bare minimum, once a week, often 3 times a week, I get these emails and people say, I don't know if this is still valid 6 years later, this email address, but, sometimes it's like, here's my story. And sometimes it's just, I don't believe that. And if they leave their phone number, I'll call them back and talk to them or leave them a message. Or if they don't, I'll send them an email. But the idea is, yes, like these are devastating emotions to go through heartbreak. And they feel very solid and very real at this time. And yet, I don't say this cliche of like time heals all wounds, but there is some form of like, I'm very confident you will heal from this. That this current way that you feel will fade and change, because that's the good news about the truth of impermanence that the Buddha taught about, that everything's impermanent, including some of the really hard times and the really negative emotions that we are dealing with. Those too are impermanent. They will shift and they will change. And then I have people write me a year, 2 years later and say, hey, I don't know if you remember me, but I reached out to you and you were very kind enough to call or to email or whatever. And you were right. I'm okay. Who knew? And it's like, I knew, like that's the nature of the beast, that these emotions are not as solid and fixed and permanent as we suspect, that they're actually much more ephemeral, which is particularly when we're struggling with hard emotions. It's very good news.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You said something earlier where you said this jerk or something like that. It reminded me of a story in a practice, actually, I think it was in the book, where you say, think of a jerk, and then is it go through their day or imagine what their day might be like? Can you talk a little bit about that practice?
Yeah, I'm happy to. It's, it's an interesting one. And it's one of those ones I'm like, some of them I'm like, I know that if someone just took those 3 deep breaths, something's going to happen to them, right? Like I'm very comfortable. This is a harder one because it's one where we're actually starting to go through, I guess it's some form of a visualization exercise, and that we are imagining, maybe is a better way of saying it, what someone else might be going through. We don't know for sure. But let's use the example of a jerk, a person that we are having a hard time with. A big thing that we do, and that's their righteous thing that I was mentioning before, if I'm right, they're wrong, is that we villainize them. And we write them off. We say, sort of dismiss their humanity. And we see this all the time these days. It's actually a very popular thing to do, to say, oh, I heard the story about this person. I don't like that. And I'm gonna, write them off, essentially. So we have that happen all the time. The interesting thing here is when we actually, I think it was Brene Brown who said it's hard to hate people up close. And I love that, because it's like, when this practice is just essentially saying, like, if I really had to face that this is another suffering human being, maybe a human being who makes mistakes, maybe a human being who, is going through their own stuff, it would be hard for me to solidify them as villain. It would be hard for me to say, I hate this person, or to write them off. and dismiss their humanity. So the practice is really to sit there and take the time, because the reason I'm like, oh, this is like a little bit harder for people to sort of access is because there's this initial tendency to be like, nope, I don't want to think of the humanity of this person. Thank you. I don't want to make them feel real to me. It's easier if they're a cartoon villain. But that's not actually helpful. So the practice is where we would imagine what they might go through. They wake up in the morning. Do they have a spouse that loves them, or an animal nearby that they take care of? What is that relationship and that interaction like? Are there things that they find difficult in their morning commute, or their kids running late for school? And, like all of these sorts of things that we might actually have to start to acknowledge, oh, this person has similar things that I go through. I also, fall behind when the kids are late for school and feel rushed, and I snap at people when I shouldn't, and so on and so forth. It's like we start to realize, oh, this is, again, it's recognizing the humanity of another person, but we sort of have to take the time. And this practice is one of just sort of mentally going through what we might imagine a typical day or a half day or whatever might look like. And I think that's for me, this practice actually arose from a period of time where I was just sort of invited to do talks and things like that. And I would end up shadowing essentially friends, people I didn't know very well, for a half day of their life, and saying, God, I had no idea that this is what they were like. A friend who was a school teacher, and I was like, God, this person's so good at their job. And I never would have known it if I didn't have to come sit here with their second graders and give a talk on Buddhism. And of course I was thrilled to do it, but like there's something here of just like, this is someone who I didn't know particularly well. I'd known them for a period of time, but it was through a friend. And to watch them come into full 3D and start to see all these various aspects of their life that I was never privy to was so heart opening. And I think we don't always necessarily, I don't recommend just sort of like stalking the person that you don't like because you want to sort of follow them around for a half day. Don't do that. But there is something to just imagine, like, what are they going through that can actually really, again, the idea here is that we'd end up in a place of compassion.
What about a loving kindness practice? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. So that is a very similar intent, we could say, in that sense of like recognizing humanity, I would say, and heart opening of the heart to people that there's many steps in it, but people that we like, people we don't know, people we have a hard time with, and of course ourselves. But the practice itself is interesting. I'm also leading a loving kindness teacher training right now, which is really fun. And it's like we're going sort of methodically week over week with just each of these steps. And it's sort of, no one's saying it's painful. It is good for all of us, but it is really like we're in the midst of just a lot of loving kindness practice. And the practice is one where it's actually a blend of a lot of different types of practices. We could, for example, visualize. We could bring an image to mind of an individual, make it visceral for us. There's a concentration aspect in that we're actually sort of keep coming back to the same phrases of offering the aspirations of well-being for these people. And also contemplative aspect, because as we say those phrases, the ideas might arise of like, what would that even look like for this person? So for example, one way that loving kindness practice might look is that we would bring ourselves to mind at first, which is always a really hard step for us Westerners. So we'd offer ourselves love. It's actually normally in that initial step, because in other traditions, they're like, why wouldn't you like yourself? This is very Western. So that should be an easy starting point. I have a whole story about that, but I don't want to spend all of our time on this. But the idea here is loving kindness, that we start with ourselves, and we might make the aspirations like, may I be happy? May I feel safe? Or one of my favorite ones, may I feel loved? We all want to feel loved. So these are basic aspirations. And they're not actually even outside of ourselves. It's not like we're sending out something to the universe or to an external deity. It's not that at all. We're just making the aspiration in our own heart. May I feel this way? And at the end of the day, who gets to decide if Lodro Rinzler is happy? Me. It's just me. Yeah, various stuff can come up and try and shake me from that. But it's up to me as to whether I'm going to be happy, whether I feel love for myself, at least, if no one else. Anyway. So then from oneself, you go to a person that you really love and admire. Sometimes in traditions, This is also broken out into an additional step of benefactor, but unless you have someone who pays for all of your food and clothing and shelter, it's often just considered lumped in with someone that you really like and that you really admire, and it's easy to offer love to. So, the running joke in my household is I always think of my wife. My wife always thinks of our dog. And that's fine. Gotten used to it. But it's just hard not to, offer love in that moment. It's the same aspirations. May you be happy. May you feel safe. May you feel loved. May you feel peaceful, whatever those may be. And then we move into someone that we don't know very well. This is often the step that I think is the most interesting. Someone just drove by my street. If I wasn't talking about neutral people, I probably wouldn't have even noticed them. I would have actively ignored that person existed. Yet here they are, right outside my door. I don't know who they are. I feel completely neutral. There's another one. Completely neutral about these people. I don't know who they are. Maybe they live here. If I knew more about them, if I imagined who they might be, maybe my heart would open to them. So to acknowledge the humanity of, the person that delivers mail to you, the person you see at the local coffee shop, your neighbor. My neighbor is over there. Actually, I like my neighbor, but I did feel neutral at some point toward them, I'm sure. And the more I started to contemplate them, the more my heart opened to them. And that's the natural progression. And then this difficult person that we talked about before, that again, it's a moment when our heart might want to shut down, but we inherently, or not inherently, we are, at least for now, moving beyond that hesitation into a sense of love that is inherent to us, and saying, could I actually even contemplate the humanity of this difficult person? Not the person who's caused me the most pain in my life, but we often start with, we can work our way up to that, but we should start with someone that's just sort of pissed us off recently. It could also be one spouse. Like, you can love your spouse, and you can also be mad that they put all the dishes in the sink or whatever. Like, you can have both in some of these situations. And then we actually dissolve the boundary of opinion of I like you, I don't like you, I ignore you, which is a very important step, that we actually start to open our heart and just love beings equally. I always think about this a little bit like if you're on an airplane and you're coming down to your home city. At first, you don't know who those people are. It's sort of like ants. It's like you see little cars going around, and then you start to get closer and closer, and then there's actual people on the ground and you land, and you're like, oh, I don't like that look of that person or whatever. But up there, it's the sense of like, there's no sense of I like you, I dislike you, I ignore you. It's just open. So it's that sense of open-hearted love that we start to manifest as we begin to contemplate all things.
Yeah. What about a gratitude practice? I speak with people often about this, and I've learned that people often say, I just forget. I know I need to do that. I just forget, though. What kind of practices and what kind of wisdom can you share about that?
Yeah. So I think gratitude practice is important. The one thing I want to say about it is that we're not negating that there are bad things in our life, right? We're not saying I am grateful for all these things and forgetting that our car is broken or whatever it is. We're actually, it's both. It's like, I'm great. It's like, what choices, as we talked about before, what choices am I making with my mind? For me, this is an informal practice, but I'll just sort of, before I get out of bed, before I even put my feet on the ground or pick up the phone or whatever, there's a sense of, let me just take a moment and ask myself, what am I grateful for? It's not a formal practice at that point, and it's rambly and it's messy, and that's fine, but it brings me to a state of gratitude because it's, it's even repetitive at times. Oh, these animals, my spouse, and the fact that we have a roof over our head, and it's like very basic stuff. But it brings us to a state of gratitude first thing in the morning before we start to pick up the momentum of the day. Because I think many of us enter the day with that sense of, wait, what am I behind on? Let me look at my phone.
Yeah.
Which is not a great way to enter the day. So if people find that helpful, they could join me in that. But the formal gratitude practice really is a sense of just sitting in mindfulness practice for a little bit and asking ourselves that question and just noticing what answers arise, giving ourselves enough space for these answers to arise. What am I grateful for today? Something comes up, we acknowledge it, we come back to the question again. What am I grateful for today? We can do this for 5 minutes. It doesn't have to be very long. And then we come out. at the end, we let go of the question. We just notice how we're feeling. And as I mentioned earlier, the idea is that we just come into a feeling of gratitude. This isn't about coming up with a great list, and like sort of ranking. Well, I like this cat. I'm more grateful for this cat than that cat, or whatever. It's not that at all. It's a sense of just like moving ourselves to that feeling, the feeling tone of gratitude.
Mm-hmm.
In the same way that loving kindness practice, for example, is not about grappling with our difficult person. It's a sense of just finding that wellspring of love that's available to us.
One of the chapters in the book is titled "Nothing," parentheses, including anxiety, is as real as we think. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Actually, someone wrote me through my website and asked for a copy of the book, so I'm mailing it to them. I'm trying to figure out which section this one is in. So
it's on 142.
Yep, okay, cool. Yeah. So that's fine. This is what I suspected, in direct relationship to those teachings on emptiness. And it is the idea, I just had wanted to make sure that the opening quote was what I thought it was. It's what was known as a mind training slogan by this Buddhist teacher known as Atisha. And Atisha really systematized a lot of core principles of Buddhism into 59 mind training slogans. And the slogan that starts this particular chapter is regard all dharmas as dreams. Dharmas, with the plural here, refers to all phenomena, not dharma with a capital D, like the teachings of the Buddha, although, well, I'm not going to get into the etymology right now, but yeah, the idea here is regard all phenomena or all dharmas as dreams. And if I was actually earlier today thinking about this because I paid for something with my credit card and I thought, oh, I had that dream last night. Well, I was very upset because I lost my credit card and I had no idea where it had gotten to. And of course, in retrospect, how silly for me in that dream to have been upset because that wasn't real, right? And yet we often hold ourselves in a similar state where it's like we tell ourselves lots of stories about things that may not even be real, or they're not as solid and fixed as we think. And that causes us pain. So to regard all dharmas as dreams, it's like, could we actually take that same sense of like, oh, this is more ephemeral than I thought, in the same way that we do in a dream. In a dream, it's like, okay, this is going to resolve itself. It's fine. In my real life, if I lost my credit card, I'd say, oh my gosh, okay, so where am I going to go? Who do I need to call? Should I just cancel it with the card company? Like, like there's a sense of like, can I start to engage with it without it being sort of everything in my life, without it becoming a major hassle and ordeal? Could I start to flow with my life a little bit more as a result of not solidifying everything and making it into such a problem? But these are the teachings on emptiness, which, as I mentioned, is sort of a lot to get into in a short conversation, but that we don't have that when we start to examine these things, even the credit card being missing or whatever, yes, we should deal with it, but it's actually much more of an ephemeral problem than we might have originally suspected. This isn't going to change our life irrevocably, and now we are a credit cardless person or whatever. We don't have to take on these identities. And that's the nature of this. It's the sense of like, could I start to relax a little bit with some of the circumstances that come up in my life and not add, we could say, that second arrow so much.
Mm-hmm. When we're anxious, many times we have this sense that we want to share how we're feeling with people. And then you offer this idea, maybe we don't want to vomit our anxiety onto others. It also happens to be a chapter name of your book. Explain that, because so I was trying to relate it to my own life. People have a problem, they're anxious about something, and they want to talk it out, so to speak. So what do you mean by that?
Yeah. So again, this is a different mind training slogan from Atisha, which is more around speech. And we do have a tendency, many of us at least, to well, let me take a step back. In Buddhism, we talk about how mind, sort of body, speech, and mind are all sort of connected. An example would be if I watch a scary movie and I engage in that activity of the body and I go straight to sleep, it's going to affect my mind and maybe I have nightmares. If I gossip all the time and use my speech that way, I might walk away from a conversation and wonder and worry, are people going to say negative things about me? That's affecting my mind. And they all are sort of interconnected, body, speech, mind, body being sort of code for the activities of the body. And, here I always think of a loved one who has trouble with anxiety. When you ask them, how are you doing? They say, well, let me tell you the thing I'm worried about. And just go straight there. Right. And that's when I say vomiting. It's the sense of like, it was overflowing in the mind and had to be released somehow.
Right.
And it's just, it's just everywhere. That's what's going on. Let me tell you exactly the 10 scenarios that I've been thinking about this. And I think we've all been exposed to someone like that. And maybe we've been someone like that. I certainly have been in the past if something really chaotic was happening. And that's if we start to work with our mind, then we are less likely to vomit in that way. Another way of doing it is to actually start working with our speech. That, years ago, a teacher told me, like, complaining doesn't help the situation. It often makes you feel worse. And I thought about it. I was like, oh, I really shouldn't complain so much. To actually hold that in my mind, like maybe it feels temporarily like scratching a really juicy bug bite, but then the bug bite's bleeding. Sorry to be gross, but like it's sort of like that. So gossip, complaining, things like that. It's like when we start paying attention to the way that we use our speech, it'll probably affect our mind in a positive way. So these things are all connected.
Yeah. Yes. You mentioned a couple of times during our conversation, somebody might send me an email. If they include their phone number, I might call them, or I'd respond to them, et cetera. And I just wanted to compliment you on your accessibility. I actually happened to be watching a video of you, and I think you were sharing a bit about your membership program or some of the workshops that you have. And at one point in the video, you encouraged the viewer to email you, and you said, hey, I'm a one-person operation over here. And something shifted in me when I heard that. And I just wanted to share that with you, because in a world where people are are marketing to us in a particular way, it can feel really inauthentic. And you are truly authentic. And there's a wonderful lesson in that for all of us. And I have a lot of gratitude to you for that.
Thank you. I mean, it's something I struggle with, to be clear. Even as I was sipping my morning coffee today, I said, oh, I'm going on this podcast. I should mention that I've got this big program coming up and so on and so forth. And I just didn't want to. It's like, and that's not what the conversation was about. Like if people are interested in my work, they can check out my website, lodrorinzler.com. And if they're attracted to it, I'm not particularly good at marketing these things. So, you sort of have to poke around and look at courses and see what courses are there and they appeal to you and so on and so forth. But I was talking, my wife is also a meditation teacher, and we were like, God, if we wanted to, half the job could be marketing ourselves. But we don't, both of us hate it. It's not that marketing itself is bad in any way, shape, or form, but it can often lead to feeling disconnected from one's authentic self. So to find ways to actually start talking about the work that we're doing without it becoming some sort of sales job or something is really important. It's also a fun topic that we talk about in the teacher trainings I lead, because it's like, I think there's any number of people that will say, well, let me tell you how you market yourself as a coach, a yoga teacher, a meditation teacher, or whatever.
Right.
And, I'm sure that there are really good time-tested, grab your attention headlines for a newsletter and things like that, which is fine. And yet, if it's only really fine if it actually feels authentic to you. So I appreciate you saying that. It's something I think a lot about, but I also, I feel like it's sort of bullshit that there are times when people sort of remove themselves from the people they're talking about. Like if someone actually took the time to read the entirety of this book, yeah, I have time to answer their email, of course. Like it's just, I don't know. It seems weird that people would not. Anyway.
I love it. And the book, correct me if I'm wrong, but proceeds from this book are going to a couple of causes. Is that correct?
Yeah. So the proceeds are going to Feeding America food banks, which has been an important resource for many people during the pandemic to have access to good and healthy food. and the Loveland Foundation, which is therapeutic resources for Black and Brown women and girls. And both are really lovely organizations. So I'm really happy that the proceeds from this book can actually go there. And it felt like a nice way for us all to sort of communally give back during the pandemic.
Thank you. It's a really, really wonderful book. I highly recommend it. There's so many real life stories in here that are relatable. I like to call them nuggets of wisdom that you can just go out and use later on that afternoon. And then there's some things that, may require some deeper thought. And I like the way you intertwined that in the book. So thank you for sharing your wisdom in words. It's not an easy thing to do. And you've done it 6 times, I think. So
well,
who knows what's around the corner.
Yeah.
So
and
Lodro,
thank you for having me here.
It's my pleasure. Absolutely. All my pleasure. And just so grateful for your time and your energy today. I know how busy you are. And so again, thank you.
Okay. Take care.
And to all the loyal listeners of the pod, I greatly appreciate your time and energy. It's something that means the world to me. And I wish you all, as always, much love and gratitude.